Super. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to your group. This, I think, I forget whether it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but it's the second time I've spoken to the East Midlands Energy Institute branch. Really pleased to be back, and as is always the case with the world of electric vehicles and e-mobility and electric vehicle charging, things have moved on quite a bit in the intervening period. What I'm going to cover in the presentation today is really a reflection of how the insights and the tools that are available, particularly to local authorities, have evolved and advanced over recent years. We'll go through a number of different tools that we make available to local authorities for free on what we call our National EV Insights and Support Platform, or NEVIS. Actually, interesting anecdote on the NEVIS thing. We had this slightly strange obsession within Cenex to name all of our models after mountains. And this was one of the first models that I developed at Cenex, and it was called NEVIS. And then after I left Cenex for a brief period, the responsibility for the model fell to a colleague whose name was Ben, and then it officially became Ben's NEVIS. Ben has now moved on, but I always like to tell that story because it's, for a little while at least, the NEVIS thing actually made sense. But within this package of tools, we have various different modelling apparatus for local authorities to understand future EV charging demand and the number of electric vehicles that will be on the road in any given area. We now have mapping and spatial insight tools available, which I'll go through in a little bit of detail. And knowledge repository, which is basically a Wikipedia for EV charging, and last but not least, procurement documents and networking and roadshow opportunities as well that we make available. So without any further ado, I will crack on into my presentation. First slide is just a bit of an introduction to Cenex. Some of you on the call might be familiar with Cenex. We're a not-for-profit sustainable transport consultancy that are based on the Loughborough University campus. We have, broadly speaking, two departments. We have a transport department, which looks at decarbonising fleets and trying to implement low and zero emission transport technology into fleets of various different sizes. And then we have the Energy Systems and Infrastructure department, which is where the majority of my work comes in, which looks at the stuff that doesn't move, looks at charging infrastructure, looks at how we can implement renewable generation and potentially storage alongside EV charging infrastructure. And we also increasingly look at quite innovative EV charging technologies, such as wireless charging systems and catenary charging systems as well. So we like to think that as a reasonably small and agile consultancy, and a consultancy that's mission-led rather than profit-led, we stay at the cutting edge of things, or we try to stay at the cutting edge of things. And I think NEVIS and the tools that we make available through it is really an example of how we're doing that. So before I crack on into the content around NEVIS, I thought I never like to assume that everybody knows everything about the wonderful world of electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, or particularly why local authorities are quite important in the transition to electric vehicles and EV charging infrastructure. So I've got a few slides just to hopefully set the scene a little bit, and apologies if this is nothing new to many on the call. I dare say there are probably a few on the call that this will be nothing new to, but I always find it helpful to make sure we're all at the same level. So the place to start is to really take a step back and look at the challenges that are really driving us towards e-mobility, towards electric vehicles. The first of which is climate change. We're trying to maintain global temperatures. Ooh, that's decided to give up on me. Interesting. Bear with me. I'll share this a slightly different way, I suppose.
I don't know what happened there.
Neither do I. Hopefully it doesn't happen again, but we'll press on and see what happens. So we got to this point, I believe. So yeah, we're trying to maintain global temperatures within 1.5 degrees warming above 1990 levels. That's something that is looking increasingly unrealistic, something that I personally feel quite strongly about, and it's one of those things that does have a tendency of getting me down, because my background was in environmental sciences, and I know the direction this is heading in, and it is not it's not something we want, but it's such a difficult case to make, and the action needed for that is both immediate and extensive. Surface transport within the UK is the worst performing sector for CO2 emissions. That became the case, I think, in 2016, and it's not necessarily a reflection of transport emissions increasing. It's more a reflection that everything else, particularly emissions from the energy sector, have decreased, as those on the call will be well aware. And as a result, we have flatlining emissions from transport. Everything else has reduced, and now transport is the single biggest contributor to the UK's CO2 emissions. And on top of that, we also have air pollution, which is caused by predominantly diesel exhaust for nitrogen dioxide, but also particulate matter from tyre and brake wear, which does come from electric vehicles as well, albeit potentially to a lesser extent for various reasons. But air pollution is really a clear and present danger to public health. It's estimated that around 36,000 people die every year in the UK as a direct or indirect consequence of poor air quality. So the challenge is really there for us to rise to. Something that's occurred a bit more recently, though, is how partisan net zero is becoming. I dare say I'm not the only person on this call that is a little bit frustrated with how something that was once very much a unanimous sort of source of agreement is now pretty much a political football. And that seemed to happen very quickly and without anyone really seeing it coming. But in the context of electric vehicles, the two really significant announcements that we've got and the really conflicting points, we have a government who are rolling back the delay on banning the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles. And we have an opposition party who are vowing to put that ban back in place. So it's a very fractured environment now, far more so than it has been for the majority of my 8 to 9 year career in this sector. So it's really interesting environment to work in. But despite all of that rhetoric, all of the politics going on, electric vehicle sales have remained very strong between 2022 and 23. We saw around a 20% increase in electric vehicle sales, according to the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. The other thing that's happened very recently, which many of us almost find a little bit ironic, because you have a government who are determined to talk down net zero and roll back on net zero and make U-turns, but actually, whilst all that was going on, they were implementing one of the strongest emission reduction policies that the UK transport system has ever seen, which is the ZEV mandate. We've now finalised the proposals for the ZEV mandate, and from 2024 onwards, we're going to see vehicle manufacturers being required to meet legally binding targets for electric vehicle sales that will ratchet up until they reach 80% at 2030. And then at that point, future legislation is anticipated to raise that to 100% by 2035. So in other words, by 2035, every newly registered car and van in the UK will need to be zero emission, which in a lot of cases, most cases, frankly, will mean battery electric vehicles. With all that going on, though, it's not, you don't have to look too far on the internet or do a Google search to any extent to find a few horror stories about infrastructure in the UK and the general discontent around the development of the UK's EV infrastructure network. And we really want to start developing an EV infrastructure network that is fit for purpose. We want to make it so that everybody can find and access electric vehicle charging infrastructure, particularly those that don't have access to off-street parking and therefore potentially a private charge point. We want to make sure that the pricing of that infrastructure is fair. And we also, and it's very key to the government's approach so far, wants to take a market-led approach to the development of the UK's EV infrastructure network. Something that's that the government has maintained quite a lot of interest in is enabling flexibility and potentially bi-directional capability into electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and that is something that is being enshrined into regulation. And lastly, innovation in the sector. We're far from done with the development of electric vehicle charging technology, both in public and in private. There's a lot of headroom for innovation, more so in the form factor of the infrastructure than necessarily the power of the infrastructure. I think we've got pretty good at making charge points very powerful and very fast, and there's not really much more we can do there, but we haven't quite cracked the form factor of EV charging and getting that right in different environments. So loads of headroom there, and Innovate UK, amongst others, are still quite well invested in the development of EV charging technologies. So with all that in mind, local authorities really do have a vital role, and that's sort of framing the remainder of this presentation. Local authorities are gatekeepers of some of the most valuable land assets in the context of EV charging. If you live in a terraced house like I do, and you park on street outside of your house, the land around that charge point is all adopted by the local authority, by the Highways Authority. So in my case, it's owned by Leicestershire County Council, who are the Highways Authority for Charnwood and for the other boroughs and districts across Leicestershire. Being the gatekeepers of that land is incredibly important. It means they have a very important role in order to provide infrastructure in such locations. The other really important thing that doesn't quite as often get spoken about is that local authorities really are in the best position to understand the needs of their residents. So if we're talking about charging electric vehicles at home, and around travel to work zones and building that into the wider travel behaviours in a local authority area, the best people to do that are local authorities. There's nobody that knows this better. The local authorities have literally been doing this for decades, and in some cases centuries. It makes them the best stakeholder to actually engage with residents and understand their needs. That being said, electric vehicle charging, as much as I feel like I've been doing this for a very, very long time, and I think that's probably because I have far more grey hairs in my beard now than I did when I started. EV charging is still quite a new and significant undertaking for local authorities particularly. This is not something that's well understood by many people at all, frankly. There's a very, very small pool of expertise when it comes to EV charging, and I don't even look in the mirror and consider myself a full-on expert. I know some of the people who get into the real technical detail of this, and I'm not one of those people. I'm one of the people that does some of the bigger thinking, I suppose. But the real experts in this sector are few and far between, and getting the best out of them is also its own challenge. What we are increasingly trying to do is help local authorities to produce local EV charging strategies so that they can determine how a local EV charging network will help meet their strategic goals, particularly regarding the environment, but also potentially economy and some of their socio-economic goals as well. And most importantly, providing them strategies that give them a basis to actually take action and stop the process of debating whether we should move forward with this, and instead provide the basis to move forward. And that's why local strategies are so important. And to produce a local strategy, you need good insight and data. The question of where you begin as a local authority is an interesting one, because there are some local authorities that have pushed on and have made some pretty incredible progress. This is not my way of taking credit for something incredible. I'll caveat before I say what I'm about to say, but my first role in the sort of EV charging space was at Coventry City Council, where I happened to be given the responsibility for updating the local EV charging network, and this was 10 years ago now. And today, Coventry has apparently the most comprehensive charging network of anywhere in the country. As in, by charge points per resident, it has the most infrastructure. I'm not taking credit for that, but it is a sign that some local authorities have really pressed on with this and know exactly what they're doing now. They really don't need any further support. They just need to cut them loose and let them go, basically. But quite a lot of other local authorities have literally taken no action at all. In many local authorities, we're still at a stage where the debate in a council chamber tends to follow the course of, well, we don't provide petrol or diesel fueling stations, so why should we provide EV charging? And that really, we should have been past that point 5 or 6 years ago across the country. That those sorts of debates shouldn't really be going on anymore. It's something we should have really put to bed. But nevertheless, it's going on, and organisations like Cenex are very much trying to help local authorities get through that point. And really key to making all that happen is providing data insights, providing best practice, providing reference materials to give local authorities confidence that this is their role. There are ways that they can act to make things better for their residents and local businesses, and also give them a degree of certainty as to how much infrastructure they should install, when it needs to be installed, and roughly what the costs associated with that are likely to be. And that really is the introduction into what the NEVIS platform is all about. So I will move on to talk a little bit about the advice that we're providing as part of the NEVIS platform. So whatever the strategy is about, whether you're making a strategy to implement electric vehicle charging, whether you're making a strategy to reinforce a distribution network, or whether you're making a strategy to implement a future systems operator, every strategy is underpinned by analysis, by information, and by insight. You cannot make a reliable strategy without a degree of data, insight, and understanding being fed into it. And this really is what the NEVIS service is trying to, the role that the NEVIS service is trying to fulfill, is to provide that analysis, information, and insight that allows local authorities to then develop their own strategies. And this is something that, as a result of a partnership we have with the government's Office for Zero-Emission Vehicles, is now being made available for free to all local authorities across England. And additionally, local authorities in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland through separate agreements with each of the devolved governments that we've reached over the past 6 months or so. And we can also make everything I'm about to present to you available to other organisations for a small fee. And when I say small fee, I mean small fee. It's not our business to extort companies for data and insight. We're very much a mission-led organisation. So if anything that I'm about to present looks like it could be of interest to you or value to you, then please feel free to get in touch, and we can see if there's a way that we can arrange access for you. So the first part, and probably the most important part of the NEVIS platform, is what we call the Insights Toolkit. And this is where we really get the nitty-gritty numbers that are needed to underpin action at a local level and a national level, understanding future demand for electric vehicle infrastructure by looking at potential forecasted adoption of electric vehicles, but then also trying to plot the benefits that this will have at a local level, both in terms of reducing emissions, carbon emissions, pollutant emissions, but also in what we call mitigated damages. To give you a bit of a glimpse at the kind of insight that this produces, so the first point there about current status, it's obviously very important for local authorities when they're deciding to act on supporting electric vehicle uptake that they understand how many electric vehicles are already being driven in their local administrative area, because it gives them not only an idea of how far along the journey they already are, but also how they compare against other local authorities. And as much as it probably shouldn't be the case, it invariably is the case that local authorities, their greatest call to action is usually when you present them with the comparison to their neighbouring local authorities and show them just how far behind they're falling. And I hope there's nobody on the call that's going to be offended by what I'm about to say, but that is there's a really, really good example of that in the East Midlands, which is that we have Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and Nottingham City Council, who I would describe as trailblazers in the context of EV charging infrastructure. And we have certain other local authorities that I won't name, although process of elimination, you could probably guess which ones, that by comparison look very, very far behind. And that's a case that is quite strongly felt within council chambers. So understanding your current status is a really important step, and that's something that we provide through the NEVIS platform. But arguably more important than that is the projections, because so many times the debate around what action you take to support EV uptake tends to stop when people put the question mark on what the demand for EV charging infrastructure is likely to be. One of the really useful benefits of the ZEV mandate that I mentioned earlier is that now that we have legal targets for electric vehicle adoption in the UK, it means actually EV uptake is fairly predictable and can be predicted with a robust basis, that it is effectively enshrined in law now, so that there's far less uncertainty around EV uptake. What you can see, the graph in the top left, is an uptake curve that was developed through the NEVIS platform for Charnwood Borough Council, which is where I'm talking to you from today and where Cenex is based at Loughborough University. And what that shows is the transition from a predominantly petrol and diesel based vehicle park, with petrol being the black, I believe, and diesel being the orange, although I might have got those the wrong way around. I can't quite make out which one is which. But how that then transitions to a vehicle park that is predominantly made up of battery electric vehicles, being the dark blue, and to a slightly lesser extent plug-in hybrid vehicles and hydrogen vehicles, far lesser extent hydrogen vehicles, I should say, in the light blue column. And having that transition and that pathway, and understanding what the future adoption of infrastructure the future adoption of electric vehicles is likely to be, is really key to taking action, because it allows us to plan exactly how much infrastructure is needed over time. What you can see in the bottom right graph is the sort of counterfactual to that, or the counterpart, I should say, to that vehicle adoption, which is how much infrastructure do we need? And that shows the increase in infrastructure that's required up to 2030. And I forget what the exact number was for Charnwood Borough Council, but it's into the thousands. And frankly, most local authorities, certainly tier 1 local authorities in the UK, will be looking at forecasts of between 4 and maybe 15,000 for most local authorities. Bigger ones like your Birmingham City Councils and Manchester's will be more than that. London will obviously be more than that, but in most cases, each local authority is going to need to provide up to around 10 or 15,000 charge points by 2030. The other insights at a local level I'll touch on a bit more briefly, the benefits in terms of CO2 reduction. It's important that we understand those. We can both forecast them and also monitor them as we go along, but it's not necessarily something that has a tangible local benefit. However, the air quality impacts certainly do. Reducing nitrogen dioxide emissions, reducing particulate emissions to a slightly lesser extent, because the tyre and brake wear is still applies, but reducing those can genuinely make a measurable improvement to public health at a local level, and this is something that we can reflect in what we call mitigated damages. So if we know how great the air quality, how greatly the air quality is going to improve as a result of electric vehicle adoption, we can actually put a value on that in terms of money saved by local health services. And that is something that tends to make quite a strong argument at a local government level as well. And last but not least, but something that is very important to many local authorities, is looking at the implementation. We've been able to predict how much infrastructure is going to be required up to 2030, but the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle is what kind of investment is needed to make that infrastructure a reality, and how private sector investment can support that business case as well. That's all something that can be provided under the NEVIS platform. Next, I'll go on to talk briefly about some of the mapping and the spatial insights. I have to apologise that these maps don't look particularly exciting, and the reason for that was that when I first gave a similar presentation to this and used this slide with another audience, that presentation was in Wales, and my colleague thought they would be helpful by producing maps that looked at Wales. And when I saw them, I was like, yeah, there's really nothing going on here. So unfortunately, some of these maps don't look particularly exciting, but the points still remain. The map on the left is probably the most interesting, at least from my perspective. I think it's probably one of the most useful as well, is what we call the residential charging index. And this is a metric that was developed by my colleagues and I at Cenex, which basically takes into account various different demographic elements that are all derived from census data. and then it applies a formula to those demographic elements, and then maps them at a local level, with the intention being to map where electric vehicle adoption is likely to be greatest, but also in areas where people don't have access to off-street parking. So that little snippet of the map there, what that is illustrating is darker areas, dark green areas, where theoretically on-street residential charging is going to be more needed than the areas that are lighter green. And this isn't necessarily to say that certain areas need a certain amount of infrastructure, but what this tool is intended to do is help local authorities prioritize investment at areas where infrastructure is likely to be needed in the short to medium term. And in practice, this index has proved to be fairly reliable, actually, considering that it was based on census data, which can sometimes be a little bit misleading. This mapping tool has been quite useful. Motability data, we have an agreement with Motability, and as a result, we can map where Motability customers are with approximate location, I should add, because we certainly don't want to be getting into any data protection issues. But we can map the approximate location of Motability customers, and what that can enable local authorities to do is determine where they might need to take special measures to ensure that local EV charging infrastructure is accessible under a standard that was developed by Motability, BSI and OZEV, which is called PAS 1899. Really interesting standard. If you've not seen it and you're interested in accessibility in public charging infrastructure, I'd thoroughly recommend taking a look, because it is quite a challenging but ambitious standard. Third on this slide, we have co-charger data, which shows approximate location of co-charger customers. Co-charger is a company that basically allows people to make their private charging charge point available to the public. So kind of like, I guess, Airbnb for EV charging. Off the top of my head, that's probably the best example I can think of. So you can register with the app. If you have an electric vehicle charge point at home, you can register with co-charger, and then users of the app can then access your infrastructure or your charge point on your driveway. They have to book, obviously, before they do, but it basically means you can take a private charge point and give it use as a public asset. And by being able to identify where co-charger customers are, we're also able to advise local authorities on where charge point sharing might actually be able to meet a significant amount of demand for EV charging, and it's something that they can definitely explore in greater detail. And then the last map that we're able to provide to local authorities through the NEVIS platform is existing charge point locations. We have a data partnership with ZapMap, who are, I think most people would agree, the leading provider of electric vehicle charge point mapping in the UK. And we have a data sharing agreement with them, which allows us to illustrate to local authorities where their existing infrastructure is. Which isn't, I wouldn't say, a particular additionality, because they could already go onto ZapMap and see that for themselves, frankly. But having it all in one place means that decisions can be made with collective insight, and also it means that some of these different spatial insights can be layered up so that you can then almost do a bit of a Venn diagram of where action is most needed. Also in the NEVIS toolkit, we have something called the knowledge repository, which I described earlier as Wikipedia for EV charging, and that's probably, apart from it not being not something that just anybody can update and edit. God, I can't even begin to imagine how much chaos that would be to administer. But the knowledge repository is effectively Wikipedia for EV charging. It goes through all of the basics around EV and EV charging terminology, but also goes into some of the really specific nitty-gritty stuff, like how to procure EV charging, commercial arrangements with different procurement models and contractual models. It goes into how to develop strategies, what kind of data and insights are needed to develop strategies, how to turn the strategy into a delivery plan, how to manage an EVI implementation project, you name it. We have an article for it within the knowledge repository. And this, as a tool, is structured in such a way that local authorities at different steps on the electric vehicle infrastructure implementation kind of journey can find the sort of content they need. So we have, broadly speaking, content for local authorities that are literally taking their first steps, all the way through to local authorities that have an EV charging network in place and are looking for advice on how that network is operated and what kind of insights can be taken from an operational EV charging network, and all of the steps in between that you can see there. The sorts of things, the number of articles, I forget what the exact number is, but we passed the 100 point quite a long time ago, and I would imagine we're probably approaching 200 or 300 different articles now that cover different topics. You can see there an example of an article we have on what kind of factors to include within an electric vehicle infrastructure strategy. We have articles on procurement and how that can be undertaken. And speaking of procurement, another thing that we make available through the NEVIS platform is procurement documents, template procurement documents. And these are important not only to local authorities to prevent them having to reinvent the wheel and waste loads of time writing brand new procurement documents, but they're also really important to industry. And the reason for this is that over the next few years, we're going to see quite a few, and when I say quite a few, I mean around 150 local authorities all procuring for EV charging infrastructure. And if they all decide to use their own documents and go their own way, that will become a nightmare for industry because they'll have to take bespoke tender responses to every single tender that they respond to. And that just has a sort of attritional effect on the capacity that industry will have to respond to those tenders. So by having template procurement documents, we're also helping industry because they know what to expect when local authorities go out to tender for EV charging infrastructure providers. Next, and I believe this is the not quite the last slide, but one of the last slides. Within the NEVIS platform, we also offer local authorities the opportunity to network with each other through a platform which we run in partnership with Energy Saving Trust. The really interesting thing about this group is that we generally find that most of the local government officers that raise questions or issues in the group, those questions are answered and the issues are resolved by other local government officers, which kind of gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling inside because it makes me realize that I'm going to be totally redundant in about maybe 3 or 4 years because people will just know this stuff and I'll have to think of something else to talk to everyone about. But it's also, it's quite heartening to see that there's quite a wealth of expertise within local authorities, and actually just by connecting the dots between different local councils, you can address a lot of the easy questions. And then between ourselves at Cenex and also Energy Saving Trust, on the odd occasion, have to sort of drop in to fill gaps where there really isn't any existing advice. And we've also been running road shows around the country, the next one of which is in Port Talbot on the 23rd of November, but it's only, I think, only available to Welsh local authorities, specifically that one. So I've included it as a teaser, but I doubt anybody on this call could actually attend it. So apologies for that one. Those roadshows have been really useful because it's allowed us to get local authorities in a room where they can engage in conversation and discussion around the experiences they're having implementing EV infrastructure networks at a local level. But also it gives us an opportunity to showcase different areas of the industry. So at all of the roadshows that we've run so far, we've had a particular theme and have invited industry stakeholders to present around that theme. So for example, we had a session that looked specifically at lamppost charging, where we had a number of different providers of lamppost charging infrastructure to explain their product and how it works and give local authorities an overview of that area of the market. We also had a roadshow that looked at what we call flush fitting charging, which is charging solutions that are designed to be totally flat to the pavement when they're not in use, which was a really interesting session. And actually, I think most people were surprised just how developed that industry has become over the last few years. And one of the more recent sessions we had looked at what government now refers to as cross-pavement solutions. So ways in which that residents can safely run a cable from a domestic charge point to an on-street car parking space outside of their home. Again, another area of the industry that has developed really rapidly over the last 12 to 18 months, and was a very interesting session to host for local authorities. So to wrap up and in summary, NEVIS platform, we developed it to help local authorities to take action, in essence, to develop strategies and plot their way forward with data, with access to knowledge and guidance on different elements, both the sort of the technical and the non-technical elements of EV charging infrastructure implementation, as well as the procurement documents and the networking that we run through the platform. Local authorities in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland can all access this this platform for free now. And if any of those on the call are joining from a local authority and have a .gov.uk email address, you can go to nevis.cenex.co.uk and sign up there. And as I mentioned earlier, it is something that we can make available to other companies, and it's not something that we're overly keen to make huge amounts of profit on as a non-profit organisation. We're more interested in seeing that we achieve good impact with the insights that we generate. So if it is something that you're interested in, feel free to get in touch and we'll see what we can do. And I do believe that brings me to the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to take questions both on what I presented, but also any random questions on electric vehicles. I'm more than happy to have a pop at if you've got any other questions you'd like to ask me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. So we'll move on to the questions. So if you look on the chat, some people have already posted questions. Feel free to add yours. So the first, I'll just go through in order. First question from Rick Greenoff. EV drivers never think that. Oh, hang on. I think there's no. Yes, EV drivers never think the charging infrastructure is good enough. However, Scotland appears to be doing better than England and Wales. Do you agree? And if so, why is this?
Oh, it's a good point, and there's one point of it which I'm not sure I'd necessarily agree with anymore, and I can back it up with a little bit of recent insight. So the first part of the question is people are never happy, and I completely agree with that. I think that one of the big issues with implementing EV charging infrastructure and the transition to EVs more generally is that it's quite a significant change, and I think one of the unfortunate things is that it's perceived as being a bigger change than I think people realise it is. By that I mean if you get the infrastructure right and you put the infrastructure in the right places, most EV users should barely ever have to do anything beyond their existing routine. So, for example, if you have a charge point at home, honestly, there are an awful lot of EV drivers who will only ever need to charge at home and never need to use public infrastructure at all. If you put charge points at supermarkets, you can charge whilst you shop at the supermarket, and you're not having to do anything more than just plug the vehicle in. Otherwise, everything else is your existing routine. But I think there's a perception that it is a far greater behavioural change than it actually is, and as a result, people do pick holes in it, and it's very, very difficult to keep people happy. The best thing I could say this does happen quite frequently, but I get into conversations in pubs around electric vehicles and people sort of talking them down and saying, nah, it's not going to work, I'm not going to do it. The best way of addressing that conversation, in my experience, is to talk about the experiences that people have when they're actually in the vehicle, and try and almost connect the dots between how people drive their vehicle now and how realistically it won't change if they move to an electric vehicle. The other question is, things are moving on faster in Scotland perhaps than England, Wales and Northern Ireland. They're definitely moving on faster in Scotland than Northern Ireland. I think just about everywhere is faster than Northern Ireland at the moment, so that one we can certainly agree on. The interesting thing about Scotland is that they moved quickly, and they delivered what's called the Charge Place Scotland network, which was a network of rapid chargers. It was one of the first really good rapid charging networks in the UK, and at the time that it was implemented and in its early years of operation, was head and shoulders above any other network in the UK in terms of its customer satisfaction. But what's happened in the time since is the original network that was invested in by Transport Scotland and by the taxpayer hasn't been upgraded as rapidly as some of the other networks across the UK have. And what's unfortunately started happening is that the quantity of infrastructure is still very good. It's starting to become unreliable. And when you have unreliable infrastructure that's in places like the middle of the Scottish Highlands, you really don't want to be stranding people in those sorts of locations. So you can see the potential for some horror stories to come out, and they have started coming out. So there's definitely a little bit of work for Scottish Government to do to really update that network in the same way that the network of charging infrastructure on motorway services in the UK has been updated over the last few years. Before that, the motorway service network in the UK had fallen into disrepair in a big way. So it's the need for iterative improvement and continuous improvement is, I think, made really apparent by things like Charge Play Scotland.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next. I'll skip the second Rick question because I think it's fair to give everyone a go. So next one from Duncan Child. How do you get LA local authorities to overcome reticence to invest in EV charging when they haven't funded petrol/diesel stations?
This is something I think I've basically made a career of for about 8 years now. So the first thing to say is that there is a mountain of private sector investment that is just waiting to be unleashed on local EV charging infrastructure networks. And so far more so than was the case maybe five to 10 years ago, local authorities that want to install EV charging infrastructure today can almost they can pretty much guarantee that they'll have some degree of private sector investment that can support that. The trade-offs for that private sector investment is that you then have a private charging infrastructure operator who will retain some, potentially most of the revenue from the infrastructure. And potentially the local authority might generate a modest amount of revenue through a small revenue share. But the more investment you get from the private sector, the more of the revenue goes out to the private sector. So there's swings and roundabouts, but the local authorities that fall into the category of we didn't do petrol and diesel filling stations, so why should we do EV charging? Actually, the idea of just enabling private sector investment is something that most of them, in my experience, tend to get on board with. And then it's just a case of what does the local authority realistically need to do to unlock that private sector investment, which is regrettably far easier said than done, and something that we work with local authorities on every day.
Okay, thanks. Next one from Scott Borders. There's anecdotal evidence of public chargers, I think, being hogged by company vehicles, 3-letter delivery companies. I'm not sure what that means. Is there any guidance on businesses having to provide chargers for their company vehicles?
The short answer to that is no. There was a change to building regulations, and this was, I think, maybe 2.5 years ago now. There was a change to building regulations that basically states that new buildings with car parks or buildings with car parks that are being renovated have to install EV charging at the point that they're built or the point that they're renovated. So there's some regulations that mandate that, albeit with some exceptions if the grid capacity is really poor. The challenge for businesses, I don't know a single fleet that is charging in public by choice. I think if you gave any business fleet the choice, they would always charge at depot or at home, potentially, if they can arrange for the vehicle to be charged at home, at the home of one of their drivers. They would always choose that over public charging, firstly, because it's considerably cheaper, and secondly, because it's considerably more predictable. And from a fleet manager's perspective, the latter is almost as important as the first. So when you have vans starting to end up on public charging infrastructure, it's really a sign of a few things going wrong. The first is that there's no charging at the depot, which might mean that the vehicle, the depot doesn't have a grid supply that's strong enough to actually charge the vehicles. And that opens up a whole other can of worms about upgrading networks for local businesses in potentially urban areas. But it's also a sign that the vehicles are driving a long way, and were battery electric vehicles particularly suitable for that role? Is that where we should have been implementing the EVs in the first place? Who knows? I think the thing that I would like to see personally is EV charging infrastructure being developed, a network of EV charging infrastructure being developed specifically for use by fleet vehicles, because I do think it's a little bit unfair that high mileage business vehicles are, very, very likely to be hogging public charging infrastructure. I see Scott's got his hand up and he asked the question, so happy to give away and welcome him to talk.
Thank you, thank you, Jacob. It's the questions coming from EV chargers are part of my job at work, and do you put an EV charger in if quarter of a mile down the road there's some high-speed Instavolts? And I think businesses should take responsibility for their own vehicles and not be relying on the public network. Otherwise, we just won't get the expansion that we need.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like I said, from my experience, I don't think any business wants to use public charging. Actually, to be fair, does any EV driver want to use public charging infrastructure? I think it's always a compromise of some description. But with businesses, it really does add uncertainty to the whole business model of running the vehicle. So if they have a choice, they'll charge at depot. And if they're charging in public, that means there's some reason why they can't charge at depot. And that's really where we need to act, is get the charging in where it's going to be cheapest for the businesses and cause as little disruption as possible to the public charging network.
Thank you.
Okay, next from Herbert Ethel. Public fast chargers tend to be very expensive, i.e. 75 pence kilowatt hour or more. Are prices likely to remain at these high levels? I guess it's a bit like expensive petrol at motorway services.
So I'm just trying to phrase this correctly. So I've worked at Cenex in 2 stints, and in the intervening period, I took what I like to jokingly refer to as a sabbatical, working for the REA, which is a trade association. And within the REA, I was responsible for the REA's EV Forum, which is a trade association that represented EV charging infrastructure providers. And the reason I provide this context is I was representing those companies at the point that the energy prices really started to spiral out of control towards the end of 2020 and into 2021. Or was it end of 2021 into 2022? I think it was, actually. My memory's that bad. Actually, no, I think it was end of 2020 into 2021. That was when it really started kicking off. And quite a few of the members, I won't name names probably because I shouldn't and can't really name names, but quite a few of the members were updating their supply agreements, and one of them in particular was updating their supply agreement right at the peak of the energy prices. And at that point, I can say this now, and hopefully you'll take it on good faith, because I wouldn't be saying it if I didn't mean it. But genuinely, some of those businesses would have been going under if they weren't charging 80, 90. I think some of them went over £1 per kilowatt hour for a little while. They really did need to do that to keep the lights on, and that's not an exaggeration. So they've come down a little bit from those highs, but you're right. I think the average that we see certainly for the kind of high power DC rapid charging networks now is around the kind of 65 to 85 pence per kilowatt hour range. I'd like to think that they would come down. The challenge or the only reason I could foresee that might not happen is there's an awful lot of investment going into this sector. A lot of that is coming from venture capital. A lot of that is coming from quite long-term hedge funds, and they are now getting a little bit picky about seeing returns in the shorter term. And as a result, some of these prices need to be higher in order to get some of the returns, in order for the businesses to actually start circulating revenue back into investment, rather than relying purely on capital investment from hedge funds and venture capital firms. So my personal opinion is 75 pence per kilowatt hour. Yeah, I think it probably, if it does come down, I don't think it will come down much. And I think the only reason it could come down significantly is if there's a major realignment in the wholesale electricity costs and the energy market more generally, which I don't think we're expecting to happen until the end of next year from what I read.
Okay, next one is from Morgan Lewis. Are the local authorities looking to support the private sector in charging infrastructure, specifically in terms of access to suitable land?
The vast majority of them are. there are some that have decided, and a very small number actually, that have decided that they want to do this themselves, and they've come up with a particular strategic case and business case for doing it themselves. A good example would be City of York Council. They have basically taken it upon themselves to operate their own rapid charging, and they've decided that there is actually a long-term business case for them to do that as a local authority. And it also means that they're in a position to keep the tariffs for using that infrastructure lower, which is obviously in the interests of local residents and businesses. So there's a case for local authorities to do this all themselves. But if I speak to 10 local authorities this week, I would say at least 8 and probably 9 of them would be taking the view that they either want to attract as much private sector investment as possible, or at the very least have a healthy share, a healthy split of public and private sector investment, and then agree some form of revenue share between the council and the operator of the infrastructure. The really interesting thing that I don't think is done quite enough just yet is local authorities actually making not just tendering contracts to provide charging infrastructure on street, but actually starting to identify plots of land where full-on rapid charging hubs can be delivered. A few local authorities have had a good go at this and have done a pretty good job. Dundee City Council springs to mind. Oxford City Council undertook something like this with their Energy Super Hub project that was in partnership with Pivot Power, as they were at the time, and with Fastned, who provided the charging infrastructure. There are examples of local authorities making patches of land available for rapid charging development, but that to me is probably an area where quite a few local authorities could do more, could take more action. But yeah, it is going on to some extent.
Okay, I've got a question. I've put my own question in. So distribution network operators for on-street parking, how do you deal with the impact of the extra load on the network? I mean, for example, an average peak demand for a house is about 1 kilowatt, but obviously electric charging is a lot more than that.
So this is, I guess, another development that's really come in maybe over the last 1 to 2 years, is that increasingly providers of on-street residential charging infrastructure are accessing flexibility markets, and they're employing a similar kind of smart charging approach as domestic charging infrastructure. So to name names, they're not the only people doing this, but it's a very good example. A company called Chargy, who specialize in lamppost charging. They currently have a time of use tariff available. Local authorities can procure them and they can use the time of use tariff, or local authorities can procure them and basically forbid them from using a time of use tariff. But we're increasingly advising local authorities to consider this, firstly because of the exact point that you've mentioned there, Andrew, which is if we're using time of use tariffs as an incentive to charge off peak, then we're basically providing flexibility to the grid without having to do any really hard engineered solutions, and potentially without really having to do much smart load management either. We're just simply driving a change of behavior. But the charging infrastructure, and particularly on-street charging infrastructure, is almost universally, in my experience, now capable of responding to signals from distribution network operators. It's not something that I think they do yet, but they have the capability to do it in future. So in the future, it wouldn't surprise me if we see situations where on-street charging infrastructure, the DNO is actually able to remotely shut it down in periods where we have serious constraints on the grid. And the capability to do that is already being put in the ground. So it's not something that we'll look back in 3 or 4 years and have massive regrets on, or at least I hope it's not.
Okay, thanks. We've probably got time for about 2 or 3 more questions. I'm just going to go back to Rick's second question now. I think everyone's had one go. So is there a specific role for local authorities in terms of providing cost-effective on-street charging for those citizens who don't have off-street parking? How can they make this equitable compared to drivers with their own charger?
That's the $1 million question. I mean, really at this point in time, I think you can access tariffs for electric vehicle charging that can do you at about 7 pence per kilowatt hour overnight, which is, I mean, even by historical standards, really, really good value. And that is weighed against the very, very cheapest on-street residential charging providers that I'm aware of, tend to sit at around 25 to 30 pence per kilowatt hour. So just basically you're paying a what I think Quentin Wilson likes to refer to as a driveway tax, or the opposite. You don't have a driveway and therefore you just have to pay more for the electricity. And there's a series of factors that dictate that. Some of it is that the electricity from a public charge point is charged at 20% rather than 5% as it is from a domestic supply. Some of it is that the infrastructure is operated in the public realm by a private company, and therefore there's certain overheads that need to be accommodated. How do local authorities get around that? One of them is to maximise the opportunities for time of use tariffs. The single most important determiner for the business case for EV charging is the margin between the wholesale electricity cost and the tariff for the electricity being supplied. The narrower that margin is, the worse the business case gets. And 1 pence per kilowatt hour difference in the size of that margin genuinely makes or breaks the entire business case for the infrastructure. So with that in mind, being able to access time of use tariffs and being able to access wholesale costs in off-peak hours makes a huge difference, because even if it's just saving you 2, 3 or 4 pence, that will make the business case. So that's number one, is very much coming on from Andrew's question before, is make sure that you're accessing economies through time of use tariffs. And the other things that are, I suppose, a little bit more recent to market, but interesting nonetheless. One is what we call cross-pavement solutions, which is basically allowing people to install a domestic charge point and then either installing a cable gully or potentially a canopy that goes overhead, which will allow them to extend that charge point to the side of the road. And there are a number of problems, practical problems with that approach. But the really strong benefit is that you're then able to access that 7 pence per kilowatt hour tariff that you just won't get anything like on a public charge point. But to deliver that solution, local authorities really do need to act, because you're talking about putting effectively a hard engineered solution into a pedestrian footway, in the same way that residents can request drop curbs. There is a role, but it's something that we're still kind of picking apart and trying to figure out the best way forward with. And there was another point I was going to get, but I think it's gone from the top of my head. I think those 2 points, frankly, are the two most important in any case. So I'll stop there.
Okay, I think there's one more question, which neatly brings us to 7 o'clock. So from Herbert Eppel, is co-charging already viable or still at the prototype stage?
No, it's at market. Co-charger were one of the businesses that I actually represented in my previous role in the Renewable Energy Association. They are at market. They're up and running. If you've got a driveway and an electric vehicle charge point, you can register it right now, and people can start using it. It's a really interesting business model, and it's something I know that the founder of the company quite well. And he definitely has a chip on his shoulder for just how little charge point sharing is talked about. But the case that he would make is, why on earth are you spending millions of pounds installing public infrastructure when we're not really sweating the private infrastructure as much as we could be? And I mean, who could argue with that? It's a completely sensible point. But yeah, the co-charger is already available. I can probably put a link in the. Bear with me a second. Not that I'm endorsing a particular company or anything like that, but if it's of interest, that's further information on co-charger. Right, thank you very much. That's a nice positive note to end on. Thank you for a really interesting talk. A bit difficult to sort of clap in these sort of meetings, but I'd like to thank you very much for your really interesting talk and also interesting answers to the questions. Thank you. I had a feeling the Q&A would be more valuable than the presentation, but hopefully they were both roughly equally interesting. Okay, well, thanks everybody, and hope to see some of you at the next one. Super. Thanks everyone. Thanks. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye.